Over the past 1,000 years, one of the longest lasting dynasties anywhere in the world would have been found right here in Korea, and that of the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from the 1300s all the way into the 20th century. That's very rare, a dynasty to be that long-lived. But it happened here in Korea, and it's even more surprising given Korea's geographical position, sandwiched between, you've got, of course, the great empire of China, the behemoth to the west and southwest, but you also have the often fierce and expansionist nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples to the north and northwest, not to mention Japan right off the coast. And yet Korea, throughout most of that time, is able to maintain its independence, or at least the Joseon are able to maintain their rule throughout all those many centuries. That's pretty amazing. One of the several ways that they did this, maintained their rule, their own power, as well as the independence of Korea, or at least autonomy of Korea, was through a strict policy of isolationism. And this was real isolationism. Very, very limited contact, if any, with most of the outside world. Very restricted contact was maintained out of necessity with China, and then here and there with Japan as well, but that's really it. For the most part, the Korean peninsula was a, politically and even economically, more or less self-contained world. Now that isolation is threatened, it seems, in the 1500s with the appearance in East Asia of Western missionaries. These are Catholic missionaries, mostly Portuguese and Spanish, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, and others who show up. They go to China first, then they go to Japan, where they convert something like 300,000 Japanese to Christianity. And by the late 1500s, they're talking about Korea as a potential mission field. But it's a testament to the Joseon's power and their strict adherence to isolationism, their ability to enforce that isolationism, that it's not until the late 1700s that we start to see the first Korean Christians. And not because of the efforts of, missionaries in Korea, Westerners in Korea, but rather probably due to the spread of Christian ideas in China. A Korean delegation will go to China, be exposed to these ideas, come back, and spread the word that way. It's not really until the 1840s. Western missionaries have been talking about Korea since the 1500s. It's not till the 1840s that the first Western missionaries show up in Korea. And these missionaries are French Catholics. There's an effort in Paris to organize and spearhead a movement to spread the gospel to Korea. And so in the 1840s, these French Catholic missionaries begin to show up. Very small numbers. They'll trickle in one by one over the next couple decades. But by about 1860, there's something like 20,000 Korean converts to Christianity, to Catholicism in Korea. Of course, all of this had to be done in secret, because technically, all of this activity was illegal. Preaching of Christianity, this foreign religion in Korea, the coming to Korea and living in Korea of these foreigners, these missionaries, no less, this was all illegal stuff. And so when in 1856, the French Missionary Society based in Paris decided to send a French bishop to Korea to lead the flock here, they had to do so in secret. And the bishop, who did indeed come here, had to operate more or less underground. See, there had been several waves of anti-Christian persecution led by the regime here in Korea already. Their martyrs had been made already. So this was serious stuff. This could be deadly stuff, both for the missionaries as well as for their converts. So this is a big deal. And it became a bigger deal when a new regime took the throne. Still the Joseon dynasty, but a new king took the throne, and the power behind the king, this is a young king, so the sort of a puppet, the true powers that be behind the king were much more serious about centralizing power around the dynasty, but also about shoring up Korea's isolationist position. That meant that the Christians were in an even more precarious position. And at this point, by the time the new king takes the throne, there's 25,000 or so Korean Christians in Korea, as well as 12 French Jesuit missionaries. To understand the Joseon dynasty's renewed interest in, harshly, strictly enforcing isolationism, all you got to do is look next door in China or next door in Japan. So China is being torn apart by internal rebellion, ethnic and otherwise. I mean, at this point, at that very time that this policy change is being instituted. The Manchu dynasty, the Qing, they're facing an existential threat in the Taiping Rebellion, among other rebellions. But the Taipings alone are stacking up tens of millions of bodies. Between the two fighting each other, tens of millions of people are dying. More, maybe twice as many as died in World War I, are dying in the Taiping Rebellion, which billed itself as a Christian rebellion. Foreign Christians might debate that, but it doesn't change the fact that the Taipings billed themselves and presented themselves as Christian. And so here's a Christian rebellion tearing China apart. And that's not all. You got the British and the French, and these other these Europeans, basically having their way with China. They seem to be able to humiliate China at will. Invade China, burn down imperial palaces, invade the capital, whatever. And China is weak, appears weak. This is a dynasty that 100 years before may have been the most powerful, led the most powerful empire in the world. The Qing dynasty now has been brought to its knees by revolt from the inside, including this so-called Christian revolt, as well as foreign meddling and intervention from the outside. Meanwhile, in Japan, you've got a Tokugawa shogunate that's been forced open by foreigners, once again, gunboat diplomacy, and a regime that's about to fall anyway to the very revolutionary and very Western Meiji Restoration. So that's what's happening in Korea's world at the time. That's the context of this shoring up of isolationism. These guys are scared for their power. And so, in 1866, the regime was able to lure out of hiding the French Catholic bishop that had been working and preaching here in secret for 10 years. Lured him out of hiding, probably with false promises, captured him, and then executed him. 8 of the other French missionaries were likewise captured and executed. But the real statement came when 10,000 Korean Christians were led to this spot. This was a military training ground. The Joseon Navy used to exercise here, right here on the Han, this stretch of the Han River, for the Joseon ruler. And the army would practice here and train here and exercise here. This was also an execution ground. And these 10,000 Koreans, these Christians, would have been led here in chains, tied up, with their hair tied up, and then beheaded. But their heads would be hanging there, tortured and then beheaded, to the tune of 10,000 people. Today this is a park and people come here and exercise and walk and run and play basketball. But this used to be an execution ground. And there's actually a shrine just inland from the bank here, a Catholic shrine. You can walk to it, and there's a sort of a commemorative display. There's a Catholic shrine to this event, as well as to other martyrs who lost their lives in Korea to the Joseon regime. One French missionary survivor was smuggled out of Korea by a convert and made his way to China, where he passed on the news of this great massacre that had taken place in Korea. And this incensed the French. They were so angry, not least of which because they were an imperial power in Asia. When you're an imperial power, when you're a foreign power, the only way that you can consistently maintain that power, generally speaking, is through a constant show of strength. So this sort of incident could not be tolerated. I mean, the French ambassador in China was calling for the Joseon dynasty's removal and that Korea should be ruled by the French. I mean, that's how insane this was. Meanwhile, the French Navy is trying to map out the Korean coast because no one knows anything. That's how successful Korean isolationism has been up to this point. There was added pressure to act too, given the fact that supposedly there were 2 French priests still alive in Korea that had not been killed yet. So there was this idea that someone had to do something, not just for reprisals' sake, not just for pride's sake, but also to rescue these guys. Anyway, in 1866, a small French force of less than 1,000 showed up in Korea, took possession of a small island off the coast of Korea, just sort of where the Han River empties into the sea there. Very small, sort of insignificant, but strategically positioned there where the Han River empties into the sea, and began to push inland. They didn't get very far. They tried to take a monastery fortress just a few miles in from the coastline there, but they were pushed back. And the second time they tried to take a fortress, a Joseon fortress there, it was even worse. Meanwhile, Joseon, reacting very quickly, amassed thousands and tens of thousands of troops to fight back against the French, and it was obvious that, you know, this wasn't going to work. Not to mention that those two priests, news came that those two French priests had actually escaped too, so that pressure wasn't there anymore. Anyway, the French decided before they left they'd bombard a little bit more, they'd loot and plunder a little bit more. In particular, they took a set of royal books, Joseon royal books. There's a royal library there. And they stole those, and those were returned just a few years ago, just a few years before the making of this video. Those were finally returned back to South Korea. In any case, the French left. The French attempt to open up Korea and exert control there failed. And 5 years later, the Americans would try something similar in sort of a diplomatic mission gone wrong, a diplomatic mission that turned into violence. Very interesting episode, worthy of a video in and of itself. But that didn't work either. Though the Americans had been able to open up Japan via gunboat diplomacy, it didn't work in Korea. Of course, the Koreans, the Joseon, adopt an even more anti-Western isolationist policy as a result of the French and American attempts at incursions. But it wasn't the French nor the Americans, but the Japanese who finally opened up Korea by force via gunboat diplomacy, the same thing that had been used on them. They used it on Korea. And over the next several decades, Korea will be the scene of sort of a tug-of-war for power and control between the Japanese and the Chinese, who feel they have the traditional claim on Korea, and even the Russians. And then in 1910, of course, the Japanese are going to out-and-out annex Korea, and that will seem to settle the question. By the time the Japanese have annexed Korea, the Joseon dynasty is officially a thing of the past.